The door slammed open behind Grace Osgood with such violence that the wood splintered against the frame. And then she was falling, her body hitting the frozen porch steps hard enough to knock the breath from her lungs. Blood dripped from the split in her lip where her husband's fist had connected, warm against her face even as the December wind cut through her thin dress like 1,000 knives. She tried to push herself up, her palms scraping against ice, but her ribs screamed in protest and she collapsed back down, gasping. "Don't you ever come back here, you worthless piece of nothing," Robert's voice echoed from the doorway, slurred with whiskey and hatred. "You hear me? You're dead to me." The door slammed shut, and Grace heard the bolt slide home with a finality that made her chest tighten. She lay there for a moment, trying to compress what had just happened, how 6 years of marriage had led to this moment. Her fingers were already going numb, and she knew she needed to move, needed to find shelter, but the pain radiating through her entire body made every thought sluggish and distant. Snow had started falling an hour ago, light flurries that now began to thicken into a proper storm. Grace forced herself onto her hands and knees, each movement agony, and began crawling away from the house that had been her prison for far too long. She had nowhere to go. Her parents were dead, her sister had moved east 3 years ago, and Robert had systematically driven away anyone who might have been her friend. The streets of Coloma, California, were empty in the storm. It was Christmas Eve 1873, and everyone with sense was inside by their fires. Grace made it perhaps 50 yards before her arms gave out, and she collapsed face first into a growing snowbank beside the road. She tried to get up again, but her body simply would not obey. The cold was creeping into her bones now, and a strange lethargy was spreading through her limbs. Maybe this was better, she thought distantly. Maybe freezing to death was a mercy compared to going back to Robert's fists and cruel words. Her eyes drifted closed, and the world began to fade into blessed darkness. The sound of hoofbeats pulled her back from the edge of unconsciousness. She wanted to call out, but her voice would not work. The hoofbeats stopped nearby, and she heard boots crunching in the snow. Jesus Christ! The voice was deep and rough, shocked. Strong hands rolled her over gently, and Grace forced her eyes open to see a man's face above her, shadowed by the brim of his hat. Snow caught in his dark beard, and his eyes were a startling blue even in the dim light. "Madam, madam, can you hear me?" Grace tried to speak, but only managed a weak sound. "I've got you," the man said, and then he was lifting her, cradling her against his chest as he stood. Grace felt the warmth radiating from him through his heavy coat, and she instinctively pressed closer, seeking that warmth like a dying flame seeks air. "Let's get you somewhere safe." He carried her to his horse, a big sorrel gelding that stood patiently in the snow, and somehow managed to mount while still holding her. Grace drifted in and out of consciousness as the horse moved through the storm, aware only of the steady rhythm of the animal's gait and the solid presence of the man holding her. When she came fully aware again, she was lying on a bed in a small cabin, blankets piled high over her. A fire roared in the hearth, and the man was wringing out a cloth in a basin of water. He noticed her eyes open and came over quickly, settling onto the edge of the bed. "Easy now," he said. "You're safe here. I'm going to clean up your face, all right. You've got some nasty cuts." Grace flinched when the cloth touched her face, and he immediately gentled his touch. "I know it hurts. I'm sorry, but we need to get the blood off so I can see how bad it is." "My husband," Grace managed to whisper, her voice hoarse. The man's jaw tightened, and something dangerous flashed in those blue eyes. "Your husband did this to you," Grace nodded, and tears began sliding down her cheeks, stinging the cuts. "He threw me out. He was drunk, and I burned the dinner, and he just kept hitting me, and then he threw me out into the snow." The cloth paused in its gentle dabbing, and when the man spoke again, his voice was cold as the winter storm outside. "He's a dead man." "No," Grace said quickly, trying to sit up. Pain lanced through her ribs and she gasped, falling back. "Please, no, he'll kill you, he'll kill both of us." "I'd like to see him try." The man set the cloth aside and met her eyes steadily. "I'm Mason Xavier. I've been working the claims up north of here for the past 2 years. And I promise you, madam, no man who beats a woman is going to do it again while I'm breathing." "Grace," she whispered. "Grace Osgood. Grace." Mason said her name like it was something precious. "That's a good name. Now, Grace, I need to check your ribs. I think some might be broken." "I'm going to be as gentle as I can, but it's going to hurt." She nodded, trusting him in a way that surprised her. There was something fundamentally different about Mason Xavier, something solid and real that Robert had never possessed. His hands were careful as he pressed along her rib cage through the blankets, watching her face for signs of pain. When he reached her left side, she could not suppress a cry. "At least 2 cracked, maybe broken," Mason said grimly. "I'm going to wrap them for you. We need to keep them stable while they heal." He helped her sit up, supporting her weight, and wrapped long strips of cloth around her torso, binding the injured ribs. Grace bit her lip to keep from crying out, tasting blood again. When he was done, she was breathing shallowly, but the sharp pain had eased to a dull ache. "Thank you," she said softly. "Don't thank me yet." Mason stood and walked to the window, looking out at the storm. "This isn't going to blow over by morning. You'll need to stay here at least a few days, until you're strong enough to move and the weather clears." "I have nowhere to go anyway," Grace said, and the reality of her situation crashed over her. She had no money, no possessions except the thin dress she wore and a husband who had made it clear she was not welcome in their home. "I don't know what I'm going to do." Mason turned back to her and his expression softened. "First, you're going to rest and heal. Then we'll figure out the rest. One step at a time, Grace." Over the next 3 days, Grace learned many things about Mason Xavier. He was 26 years old, from Texas originally, and had come to California during the tail end of the gold rush hoping to make his fortune. He had not struck it rich, but he had done well enough to own his claim in this small cabin. He was patient and kind, making her broth when she could not stomach solid food, checking her injuries with gentle hands, and never once making her feel like a burden. She also learned that he was a man of his word. On the second day, when the storm had finally cleared, the town marshal came to the cabin. Grace heard their voices outside and fear seized her heart. Had Robert reported her missing? Would they make her go back? But when Mason came back inside, his face was set in hard lines. "Your husband has been spreading it around town that you ran off with another man. The marshal wanted to know if I'd seen you." Grace felt sick. Of course Robert would lie, he always did. "What did you tell him?" "The truth. That I found you bleeding in a snowbank on Christmas Eve, and that any man who would throw his wife out into a blizzard to die is not fit to call himself a man." Mason crouched beside the bed so they were eye level. "The marshal's going to want to talk to you when you're feeling better. He needs to hear your side of things." "Robert will say I'm lying," Grace said bitterly. "He always does. No one ever believes me." "I believe you," Mason said simply, "and I'm not the only one. There are good people in this town, Grace. They'll listen." Grace wanted to believe him, but 6 years with Robert had taught her that the world was rarely kind to women in her position. Still, she nodded, because what else could she do? That evening, as Mason was preparing dinner, Grace finally felt strong enough to get out of bed. She wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and walked slowly to the table, easing herself into a chair. Mason looked up from the stove, surprise and approval crossing his face. "You should be resting," he said, but there was no censure in his voice. "I've been resting for 3 days," Grace replied. "I need to do something or I'll go mad." Mason brought over 2 plates of fried potatoes and salt pork, simple fare, but it smelled like heaven. They ate in comfortable silence for a while, and Grace marveled at how natural this felt. She had eaten hundreds of meals with Robert, and everyone had been fraught with tension, wondering if she had prepared the food right, if he would find some fault that would set off his temper. "Why did you marry him?" Mason asked suddenly, and then shook his head. "I'm sorry." "That's not my business." "No, it's all right," Grace said. She set down her fork and stared at her plate. "I was 18. My parents had just died of fever and I was alone and scared. Robert was charming at first. He said all the right things, made all the right promises. I thought he would take care of me." She laughed, a bitter sound. "He did, in a way. He made sure I knew exactly how worthless I was every single day." "You're not worthless," Mason said fiercely. "Don't ever let his poison make you believe that." Grace looked up and met his eyes, seeing the conviction there. Something warm unfurled in her chest, something that felt dangerously like hope. "Why are you helping me? You don't know me. I'm another man's wife. This could cause you trouble." Mason leaned back in his chair, considering his words. "My father used to hit my mother. I was just a boy, too small to stop him. I swore that when I was big enough I'd never let it happen again. But he died before I could make good on that promise." He met her gaze steadily. "I see you, Grace, and I see my mother. And I'll be damned if I stand by and let it continue." Grace felt tears welling up again. "I'm sorry about your mother. She got away eventually, moved to San Francisco and married a good man, a shopkeeper. She's happy now." Mason smiled slightly. "Sometimes people get second chances." The next day, Marshal Cooper came to take Grace's statement. He was an older man with kind eyes, and he listened quietly as Grace recounted that terrible Christmas Eve, the beating, being thrown out into the snow. Mason sat beside her the whole time, his presence a silent support. "Mrs. Osgood, these are serious accusations," the marshal said when she finished. "But I'm inclined to believe you. Your husband's story doesn't make sense, and frankly, this isn't the first complaint I've had about him. There was an incident at the saloon 2 months ago where he got violent with one of the girls there." Grace was not surprised. "What happens now? I'm going to have a talk with your husband. At minimum, he committed assault. If you want to press charges, I'll back you." The marshal stood, settling his hat on his head. "In the meantime, you stay here where it's safe. Xavier, you keep a gun close, you hear me? Robert Osgood has a mean streak." After the marshal left, Grace felt simultaneously relieved and terrified. She had taken a step she could not take back, and she had no idea what Robert would do when he found out. Mason seemed to sense her fear. "He won't get to you," he said quietly. "I promise." That night, Grace could not sleep. Every sound outside made her jump, convinced it was Robert coming for revenge. Finally, she got up and walked to the main room where Mason was sitting by the fire cleaning his rifle. He looked up as she approached. "Can't sleep. Every time I close my eyes, I see him," Grace admitted. "I keep thinking he's going to break down the door." Mason set the rifle aside and gestured to the chair across from him. Grace sat, pulling the blanket tighter around herself. The fire cast dancing shadows across Mason's face, highlighting the strong line of his jaw, the concern in his eyes. "Tell me something good," Grace said suddenly. "Tell me about Texas or your claim or anything that isn't about fear and pain." Mason smiled, and it transformed his face. "All right. When I was a boy, maybe 10 years old, my grandfather taught me to ride. Not the basic stuff, but really ride, like the vaqueros do. He was half Mexican, my grandfather, and he could make a horse do things that seemed like magic. As Mason talked, his voice low and soothing, Grace felt herself relaxing. He told her about wide, open spaces and summer thunderstorms, about horses that ran like the wind, and the way the desert smelled after rain. He told her about coming to California with nothing but the clothes on his back and a dream of gold, about learning to work a claim, about the satisfaction of finding even a small nugget after days of backbreaking labor. "You ever regret it?" Grace asked. "Leaving Texas?" Mason was quiet for a moment. "Sometimes. But if I had not come here, I would not have found you in that snowbank. So no, I don't regret it." Grace felt heat rise in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the fire. "Mason." A gunshot shattered the window, and Mason was moving before Grace could even scream. He pulled her down to the floor, covering her body with his own as more shots rang out, splintering wood and sending glass flying. "Stay down," Mason growled. He grabbed his rifle and crawled to the wall beside the broken window. "Osgood, you coward, show yourself. Send out my wife." Robert's voice, drunk and furious, came from somewhere in the darkness. "She's mine. You have no right to keep her. She's not property," Mason shouted back. "And she's not going anywhere with you." More shots answered him, and Mason returned fire, the muzzle flash bright in the darkness. Grace pressed herself against the floor, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. This was her nightmare made real, Robert coming for her with violence and rage. The shooting stopped suddenly, and they heard hoofbeats galloping away. Mason stayed at the window for a long moment, rifle ready, before finally lowering it. He turned to Grace, his eyes searching her for injury. "Are you hurt?" Grace shook her head, unable to speak. Mason crossed to her quickly and pulled her up, wrapping his arms around her. She buried her face in his chest and finally let the fear come out in great shaking sobs. "I've got you," Mason murmured into her hair. "He's gone. You're safe." But Grace knew it was not over. Robert would come back. He always did. Marshal Cooper arrived within the hour, having heard the shots from town. He surveyed the damage with a grim expression. "That's it. I'm getting a warrant for his arrest. This is attempted murder." "He'll run," Grace said numbly. She was sitting at the table wrapped in a blanket while Mason boarded up the broken window. "He won't let you take him." "Then we'll hunt him down," the marshal said. "Mrs. Osgood, I'm deputizing Xavier here. He's going to keep you safe while I round up a posse." Mason turned from the window. "I'm not leaving her alone. Bring her with you then, but keep her out of the line of fire." The marshal headed for the door. "I'll gather some men. We ride at first light." After he left, Grace looked at Mason helplessly. "This is my fault. I've brought this trouble on you." "This is not your fault," Mason said firmly. He came and knelt in front of her chair, taking her cold hands in his warm ones. "You did not make him cruel. You did not make him violent. Those choices are his, Grace, not yours." "I'm scared," she whispered. "I know, but I meant what I said that first night." Mason's blue eyes were steady and sure. "He's a dead man if he tries to hurt you again. I won't let him touch you." Grace looked at this man who had become her protector, her friend, and possibly something more, though she barely dared let herself think it. "Why? Why would you risk your life for me?" Mason was quiet for a long moment, his thumbs rubbing gentle circles on the backs of her hands. "Because from the moment I saw you in that snowbank, bloodied and freezing, something in me knew. I don't have words for it, Grace. I just knew that you were important, that protecting you was the most important thing I'd ever do." Grace's breath caught. She had been married for 6 years and had never once felt cherished, protected, or valued. Robert had spent their entire marriage tearing her down, making her small. But Mason, this stranger who had found her dying in the snow, made her feel like she mattered, like she was worth protecting. I don't know what to say, she managed. You don't have to say anything, Mason said gently. He stood but kept hold of one of her hands. Come on. You should try to get some sleep. We have a long day ahead tomorrow. He helped her back to the bedroom and Grace lay down fully clothed, too anxious to change. Mason hesitated in the doorway, clearly torn. Will you stay? Grace asked. Just until I fall asleep. I don't want to be alone. Mason nodded and pulled a chair up beside the bed, settling into it with his rifle across his lap. Grace closed her eyes, comforted by his presence, and eventually exhaustion pulled her under. The posse rode out at dawn. Grace rode on Mason's horse, sitting in front of him with his arms around her as he handled the reins. It felt intimate and safe, and Grace tried not to think about what it meant, that she felt safer on horseback in a manhunt than she ever had in her own home. They tracked Robert to an old mining camp north of town. He had holed up in one of the abandoned shacks, and he came out shooting when the marshal called for his surrender. Grace watched from a safe distance, her heart in her throat, as Mason and the other deputies returned fire. It was over quickly. Robert, drunk and reckless, made the mistake of charging the posse. Mason's shot took him in the shoulder, spinning him around, and the marshal's shot caught him in the chest. Robert went down hard and did not get up. The marshal checked him and shook his head. He's dead. Grace felt a strange numbness settle over her. She should feel something, she thought. Grief, or relief, or horror. But all she felt was empty. 6 years of her life had been chained to that man, and now he was gone, and she did not know who she was without that weight. Mason rode back to her, his face tight with concern. Grace, is it really over? She asked. It's over, Mason confirmed. He dismounted and helped her down, his hands lingering on her waist. You're free now. Free. The word felt foreign and frightening. Grace had not been free since she was 18 years old. She did not know how to be free. The ride back to town was quiet. The marshal assured Grace that there would be an inquest, but that it was clearly a case of self-defense and she had nothing to worry about. Robert would be buried in the town cemetery, and that would be the end of it. Mason took her back to his cabin, and Grace moved through the rest of the day in a daze. She helped him fix dinner, washed the dishes, and sat by the fire as night fell. Mason watched her with worried eyes but did not press her to talk. Finally, as the fire burned low, Grace spoke. I should feel relieved, or happy, or something, but I just feel numb. You've been through a terrible ordeal, Mason said gently. Give yourself time to heal, Grace. You don't have to feel anything right now. What happens now? Grace looked at him. I have no home, no money, no family. I don't even know who I am without him telling me. Mason moved from his chair to sit beside her on the floor, his back against the hearth. Now you figure out who you want to be. You're 24 years old, Grace. You have your whole life ahead of you. I don't know how, she whispered. Then we'll figure it out together, Mason said. If you want to, that is. I know I'm just some rough cowboy who works a claim, but you're welcome to stay here as long as you need. No obligations, no expectations. Just a safe place to heal and find yourself again. Grace looked at him, this man who had saved her life, and asked nothing in return. Why would you do that? Because I care about you, Mason said simply. I know it's too soon, and I know you've been through hell, but I need you to know, I care about you, Grace. And I think, given time, it could be more than that. But only if you want it to be. I'll never push you, never force you. The choice is always yours. Tears slipped down Grace's cheeks, but they were not tears of sadness. I think I'd like that, she said softly. I think I'd like to figure out who I am and maybe who we could be together. Mason smiled, and it was like sunrise after a long, dark night. Then stay. For as long as you want. The winter months passed slowly. Grace healed both physically and emotionally. Her ribs mended, the bruises faded, and gradually the fear that had been her constant companion began to ease. Mason was patient and kind, never demanding more than she was ready to give. He taught her about working the claim, and Grace found satisfaction in the physical labor, in seeing the results of her own efforts. She learned to shoot, to ride properly, to cook over an open fire. She learned who Grace Osgood was when she was not afraid. And she learned what it felt like to fall in love with a good man. It was not dramatic or sudden. It was quiet and steady, building day by day like layers of sediment becoming stone. It was in the way Mason always made sure she had the warmest blanket. In the way he listened when she talked about her dreams and fears. In the way he laughed at her jokes and took her opinions seriously. In the way he looked at her like she was precious. Spring came to California with a riot of wildflowers, and Grace stood on the porch of Mason's cabin, breathing in the sweet air. She had been there almost 4 months now, and this place felt more like home than anywhere she had ever lived. Mason came up behind her and Grace leaned back against him naturally, letting his arms come around her waist. It had taken her weeks to be comfortable with casual touch again, but now she craved it, the simple reassurance of his presence. "What are you thinking about?" Mason asked, his breath warm against her ear. "I was thinking that I'm happy," Grace said. "Is that all right? Is it wrong to be happy when my husband's been dead for only 4 months? Your husband made you miserable for 6 years, Mason said. I think you're entitled to be happy now." He hesitated, then said, "Grace, I need to ask you something." Grace turned in his arms to face him, seeing nervousness in his eyes. "What is it?" Mason took a deep breath. "I love you. I've been in love with you since sometime around the 2nd week you were here, when you burned breakfast and laughed about it instead of being afraid. And I know it's too soon, and I know you might not feel the same way, but I need you to know. I want you to stay, not as a guest or someone I'm helping, but as my partner. My equal, my wife if you'll have me." Grace's heart was hammering, but not with fear, with joy bright and fierce. "I love you too," she said. "I didn't think I could, not after everything with Robert. I thought I was too broken. But you put me back together, Mason. You showed me what love is supposed to look like, so yes, I'll marry you. I'll stay with you. I'll build a life with you." Mason's face lit up with such pure happiness that Grace felt tears spring to her eyes. He cupped her face in his hands and kissed her, gentle and reverent, and Grace kissed him back, pouring all her hope and love and gratitude into it. They were married 3 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the church in Coloma. Grace wore a new dress, blue calico that Mason had bought her, and she carried wildflowers. Marshall Cooper stood as witness, along with some of the other miners who had become friends. It was nothing like her first wedding, with Robert's family sneering at her lack of dowry and Robert himself already 3 drinks in by noon. This was joyful and real, and when Mason slipped the simple gold band on her finger, Grace felt like she was finally, truly beginning her life. Their wedding night was tender and patient. Mason took his time, always watching her face, making sure she was comfortable and willing. He erased the memories of Robert's rough demands with gentle touches and murmured words of love. When Grace cried, he held her and told her she was beautiful, she was strong, she was his everything. And when they finally came together, it was a revelation. This was what it was supposed to be, Grace realized. This partnership, this mutual pleasure and care, this was love. The summer passed in hard work and contentment. Grace helped Mason work the claim, and while they did not strike it rich, they did well enough. They made plans for the future, talking late into the night about expanding the cabin, maybe starting a small ranch, having children someday when they were ready. Grace had never dared to hope for children with Robert, terrified of bringing a child into that house of violence. But with Mason, she could imagine it. A son with his father's blue eyes, a daughter with her mother's determination, a family built on love and respect. It was late August when Grace realized she was pregnant. She had suspected for a few weeks, but when she was certain, she found herself both excited and terrified. She waited until after dinner to tell Mason, when they were sitting on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky gold and red. "Mason, I need to tell you something," she said, taking his hand. He looked at her, immediately attentive. "What is it?" "I'm pregnant," Grace said, watching his face carefully. "We're going to have a baby." For a moment, Mason just stared at her. Then a slow smile spread across his face, growing until he was beaming. "A baby? We're having a baby." "Yes," Grace said, and then she was laughing as he pulled her into his arms, spinning her around despite her protests. "Mason, put me down." "We're having a baby," he repeated, setting her down but keeping his arms around her. "Grace, you've made me the happiest man alive." "You're not worried?" Grace asked. "It's so soon." "We've only been married 4 months. I'm not worried at all," Mason said firmly. "We're going to be wonderful parents. Our child is going to be so loved, Grace, so loved." And Grace believed him. She believed it with every fiber of her being. The pregnancy was not easy. Grace was sick for the first 3 months, barely able to keep food down. Mason fretted and fussed, bringing her crackers and ginger tea, rubbing her back when the nausea got bad. But Grace did not mind the difficulty, because it meant new life was growing inside her, a life created from love and hope. As her belly swelled, Mason became even more protective. He insisted on doing most of the heavy work at the claim, though Grace still helped with the lighter tasks. He talked to the baby every night, his hand on her stomach, telling their child about the world it would soon enter. Grace would lie there, her fingers threaded through his hair, and marvel at how completely her life had changed in less than a year. The baby came on a cold February night in 1875. The midwife from town barely made it through the snow, and the labor was long and hard. Grace screamed and cried, certain she would die, but Mason was there the whole time, holding her hand, mopping her forehead, telling her she was strong, she could do this. He loved her. When the baby finally came, slippery and squalling, the midwife announced, "It's a boy." Grace collapsed back against the pillows, exhausted and elated. Mason cut the cord with shaking hands, and then the midwife placed their son in Grace's arms. He was red-faced and perfect, with a shock of dark hair and the brightest blue eyes Grace had ever seen. "He looks like you," Grace said softly, touching the baby's tiny hand. "He has your nose," Mason countered, sitting on the edge of the bed and wrapping his arms around both of them. "He's perfect." They named him Matthew after Mason's grandfather. Mason Xavier, born in a mining cabin in the California mountains, wanted and loved beyond measure. The first few months were exhausting. Matthew was a hungry baby, waking every few hours to nurse, and Grace spent her days in a fog of sleeplessness. But Mason was there for every moment, changing diapers, walking the floor with a crying baby in the middle of the night, singing off key lullabies that somehow always worked. They were partners in every sense of the word, sharing the burdens and the joys equally. When Matthew was 6 months old, Mason came home from town with news. "I sold my claim," he said. Grace looked up from where she was mashing vegetables for Matthew. "You what?" "I sold my claim," Mason repeated. He sat down at the table, his expression serious. "I got a good price for it, Grace. And I bought land instead. 100 acres just south of town with good grass and water. I'm going to start a ranch." "A ranch," Grace breathed. She had known Mason was not entirely happy mining, that his heart was really with horses and cattle. "Oh, Mason." "I want to build us a real house," he said, reaching across the table for her hand. Something solid with room to grow. I want to raise our children somewhere they can run and play, somewhere they'll never know fear. I want to build a life with you, Grace. A real life." Grace felt tears spill over. Yes, yes, let's do that. They broke ground on the house in October. Mason hired some men from town to help with the construction, and by Christmas, the frame was up. Grace would walk through the skeleton of their future home, Matthew on her hip, and try to imagine it finished. A real kitchen with a proper stove. A parlor with windows that faced the mountains. Bedrooms for their children, as many as they might be blessed with. The house was finished by the following spring. A sturdy 2-story structure with a wide porch and a stone chimney. Grace cried when she saw it complete, overwhelmed by the fact that this was hers, truly hers, built by a man who loved her. They moved in on a warm April day, and that night they christened every room, laughing and giddy as teenagers. Mason started building his herd slowly, buying cattle and horses whenever he could afford them. Grace kept a garden and chickens, and gradually the ranch began to take shape. It was hard work, relentless and exhausting, but they were building something together, and that made all the difference. Matthew grew into a happy, energetic toddler, always into everything, fearless and curious. Grace and Mason would watch him playing in the yard and shake their heads in amused exasperation. Grace got pregnant again when Matthew was 2, and this time it was a daughter. They named her Emily, and she had her mother's brown hair and her father's steady temperament. The years flowed by, marked by the seasons and the rhythms of ranch life. They had good years and bad years, droughts and floods, times when money was tight and times of plenty. But through it all, their love remained constant and true. Mason never raised his hand to Grace in anger, never spoke cruel words, never made her feel small. And Grace blossomed under that love, becoming strong and confident, a partner in every sense. When Matthew was 10 and Emily was 8, Grace got pregnant again, unexpectedly. She was 34 now, and she had thought her childbearing years were behind her. But she and Mason welcomed the surprise with joy. The baby, another boy they named Samuel, was born in the big house on the ranch, surrounded by family. Time moved on. The children grew, helping with the ranch work, learning to ride and rope and raid. Matthew grew into a quiet, serious young man who had his father's way with horses. Emily was spirited and fierce, never backing down from a challenge. Samuel was the baby, indulged and adored by his older siblings. Grace and Mason grew older together, their hair going gray, their hands becoming weathered from years of hard work, but their love never faded. If anything, it grew deeper, richer, tempered by time and hardship and joy. Every morning, Grace woke up in Mason's arms and felt grateful. Every night, she fell asleep to the sound of his breathing and felt safe. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Mason took Grace back to Coloma. They walked through the town, past the church where they had married, past the spot where his old cabin had stood before they tore it down. And then Mason led her to the place where he had found her that terrible Christmas Eve so long ago. "This is where it started," Mason said, his arm around her waist. "This is where I found you." Grace looked at the ordinary bit of road, now green with summer grass, and remembered lying in the snow, certain she was going to die. How far she had come from that broken, beaten woman. How much she had become. "You saved my life," she said softly. "No," Mason said. "You saved yourself, Grace. You had the courage to survive, to heal, to love again. All I did was give you a safe place to do it." "We saved each other," Grace said, turning in his arms to face him. At 44, she was no longer young, but she felt more beautiful than she ever had at 18, because Mason looked at her like she hung the moon. "I love you, Mason Xavier. I've loved you for 20 years, and I'll love you for 20 more. And I'll love you for 40 more after that, Mason said, and kissed her in the middle of the road, not caring who saw. They returned to the ranch as the sun was setting, painting the sky the same gold and red as that first evening on the porch when Grace had told Mason about the baby. Their children were waiting for them, Matthew now 22 and helping run the ranch, Emily 20 with a beau she was thinking of marrying, and Samuel 12 and still full of mischief. Dinner was loud and chaotic, full of laughter and argument and the comfortable chaos of family. Grace sat at the head of the table, Mason at the other end, and looked at what they had built. Not just the house and the ranch, but this family, these people who loved each other fiercely and without reservation. After dinner, when the children had gone to bed, Grace and Mason sat on the porch as they had done thousands of times before. The night was warm and full of stars, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called. "You ever think about that night?" Grace asked. "When you found me?" "Sometimes," Mason admitted. "I think about how close I came to not riding that way. I almost took the North Road home. If I had, I would have missed you." "Fate," Grace said. "Love," Mason countered. He took her hand, his thumb running over the simple gold band she still wore. "I knew the moment I saw you, even broken and bleeding. I knew you were going to be important to me." "I knew too," Grace said. "When you said he was a dead man, I knew you meant it. I knew I was finally safe." They sat in comfortable silence, hands linked, watching the stars wheel overhead. Somewhere in the house, Samuel cried out from a nightmare, and Grace heard Matthew's voice soothing him back to sleep. Emily's light was still on, probably reading by candlelight again. This was her life, Grace thought. This home, this family, this man beside her who had given her everything. She had been thrown out to die in the snow, broken and worthless. And she had been found by someone who saw value in her, who showed her what real love looked like, who built a life with her based on respect and partnership and unwavering devotion. "Thank you," Grace said softly, "for everything." "Thank you," Mason replied, raising her hand to his lips, "for choosing me, for building this life with me, for loving me. Always," Grace promised, "for the rest of our days and beyond." And as they sat together under the stars, Grace knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. She was no longer that frightened woman in the snow. She was Grace Xavier, wife and mother and rancher, strong and loved and free. And she would be, until the end of her days, held safe in the arms of the cowboy who had saved her life and given her a reason to live. The future stretched out before them, bright and full of promise, and Grace walked into it with Mason by her side, ready for whatever came next. Together, they had built something beautiful from ashes and pain, a testament to the power of love and second chances. And it was more than enough. It was everything.